The year was 1943. Across the skies of Europe, Allied bombers thundered toward enemy lines, their bellies packed with explosives, their crews young and terrified. Each mission meant threading through flak, fighters, and the kind of fear that never really left a man's bones. The chances of survival were grim. 1 in 5 bombers never made it back. For every formation that returned, another vanished into the smoke and clouds over occupied territory. Commanders tried everything: thicker armor, more guns, faster engines. But no matter how many adjustments they made, planes kept falling. Each wrecked bomber told a story of courage, but also of mystery. Why did some planes survive the exact same missions, others didn't? The answer wasn't on the battlefield. It was hidden in the numbers. At the Statistical Research Group in New York, far from the noise of war, a quiet team of mathematicians and scientists worked in cramped rooms filled with chalkboards, coffee cups, and the constant tapping of typewriters. They weren't soldiers, but their weapons were formulas, logic, and patterns. Among them was a man who didn't look like a hero. Thin, bespectacled, with the calm voice of a professor rather than a commander. His name was Abraham Wald, and though few knew it then, he was about to save more lives than any general or ace pilot. When military officials brought in data from hundreds of returning bombers, the walls of the research room were soon covered in diagrams, outlines of planes dotted with bullet holes. Engineers pointed to the riddled wings, fuselage, and tails, arguing these were the areas that needed reinforcement. After all, these were the parts most often hit by enemy fire. But Wald stood silently, his eyes moving over the charts. Something didn't add up. Everyone else saw where the planes were damaged. He saw what the data didn't show. The military saw bullet holes as evidence of weakness. Wald saw them as proof of survival. Every one of those bullet-riddled bombers had made it home. The real mystery was the missing data, the aircraft that never returned. They didn't have bullet holes in these areas because they never made it back to be counted. To the officers, the problem seemed straightforward. To Wald, it was a lesson in perspective. In war, as in statistics, what you see is only half the story. The other half, the invisible half, could mean the difference between life and death. He didn't yet know it, but this insight would ignite one of the most brilliant and counterintuitive breakthroughs of World War II. While generals planned battles on maps, Abraham Wald was quietly fighting a war of the mind, one that would save thousands of airmen he would never meet.
As the months passed, the results of Abraham Wald's analysis began to echo across airfields in Europe and the Pacific. Bomber crews who once faced almost certain death now returned with increasing frequency. The difference was subtle on paper: a few sheets of reinforced metal, a shift in armor distribution. But on the ground, it meant fathers coming home to their families, brothers reuniting, and letters that no longer needed to begin with, "We regret to inform you." Wald never stood on a runway to watch the planes land, never heard the roar of engines returning from a mission. His war was silent, fought in equations and probability models, far from the noise of gunfire. Yet his quiet contribution saved thousands of airmen who never even knew his name. In New York, the Statistical Research Group continued their work, tackling new wartime problems with the same relentless logic. But even among his peers, Wald's mind stood apart. He wasn't just solving equations, he was seeing humanity through mathematics. Each number represented a heartbeat, each variable a human life. After the war, his brilliance earned him global recognition, but true to his nature, Wald never sought fame. He returned to teaching, focusing on research and mentoring young minds. His theories went on to shape modern statistics, economics, and data science. What he had uncovered, the concept of survivorship bias, would become one of the most powerful lessons in decision-making ever recorded. Yet, his story didn't end in triumph alone. In 1950, on a flight through the rugged mountains of India, Abraham Wald's plane crashed. The man who had saved so many airmen perished in the very skies his ideas had helped make safer. The news barely made headlines. No medals, no monuments, just a brief obituary for a quiet mathematician. But history remembers in whispers as much as in shouts. In time, Wald's legacy resurfaced, not as a tale of war, but as a timeless lesson in perception and truth. His work taught the world that sometimes the answers we need are hidden in what's missing, in silence, in shadows, in the invisible threads that connect every decision. He proved that intelligence doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a weapon. Sometimes it sits behind a desk, holding a pencil, and changes the world without firing a single bullet. Today, every statistician, engineer, and strategist who questions the obvious owes something to Abraham Wald. His genius didn't just save planes, it reshaped how humanity thinks about evidence, risk, and survival. In a war defined by destruction, he found a way to build life. And though his voice is long gone, his lesson endures, that sometimes true vision lies not in seeing more, but in seeing what others never thought to look for.
The brilliance of Abraham Wald's insight lay in its simplicity and in its courage to question what everyone else accepted as truth. While most minds were trapped by what they could see, Wald had the rare ability to see what was missing. In the world of statistics, this wasn't just cleverness, it was revelation. At the Statistical Research Group's modest office on Broadway, the team began applying Wald's logic. Charts were redrawn. The bullet patterns on returning aircraft were reinterpreted. Instead of reinforcing the wings or the outer fuselage, engineers redirected armor toward the engines, cockpit, and fuel systems, the vital areas that had shown no damage on the surviving planes. To the untrained eye, it seemed absurd. Why protect parts that didn't appear to be under attack? But to Wald, those safe areas were where disaster struck, the invisible evidence left behind by the bombers that never came home. His insight turned the absence of data into data itself. When his calculations reached the U.S. Army Air Forces, skepticism turned into astonishment. Commanders ran field tests, and the results confirmed what the numbers had whispered all along. Planes reinforced according to Wald's analysis began returning from missions at significantly higher rates. The losses dropped. Lives were saved, not by new weapons, but by a new way of thinking. Behind every chart and formula lay a human truth. Each data point represented an aircrew. Young men in leather jackets and oxygen masks, flying into flak-filled skies, praying to make it home. Wald never met them, but his equations became their shield. He didn't wear a uniform, but he fought for them, through logic, not gunfire. His discovery soon became a cornerstone of a larger idea, what we now call survivorship bias. It's the tendency to draw conclusions only from what we can see, forgetting about what's missing from the picture. In war, it meant reinforcing the wrong parts of bombers. In life, it means making decisions from incomplete truths. Wald's lesson reached far beyond the battlefield. Never trust the visible without asking what's invisible. Yet for all his genius, Wald remained humble. He never saw himself as a hero. To him, the equations were just extensions of truth, tools to uncover what others overlooked. When colleagues praised his brilliance, he smiled politely and returned to his chalkboard, as if to say the work wasn't done. What made Abraham Wald extraordinary wasn't just his mind, it was his perspective.
In a world obsessed with noise and spectacle, he found wisdom in silence, reason in absence, and patterns in chaos. He had looked into the sky and seen not the bombers that returned, but the empty spaces where others had vanished. And in those silent gaps, he discovered a formula that would save thousands of men from sharing the same fate.
The meeting room fell silent as Abraham Wald stood before a wall of diagrams. Each sheet showed a bomber's silhouette peppered with black dots, bullet holes marking where returning planes had been hit. Around the table, senior officers waited for the mathematician's recommendation. Their question was simple: where should we add armor? The answer, however, was anything but simple. The generals and engineers had reached their conclusion before Wald even entered the room. "Look at these wings," one officer insisted. "They're full of holes. We'll reinforce the wings and the fuselage. Clearly, those are the areas the enemy aims for." Wald studied the charts quietly, the air heavy with cigarette smoke and impatience. His eyes didn't rest on the clusters of holes. They drifted to the blank spaces, the untouched zones, the places that seemed safe. When he finally spoke, his words shattered the room's certainty. "Gentlemen, you are looking at the planes that made it home." The officer stared. Wald continued. "The bullet holes show where a bomber can be hit and still survive. The missing holes, the areas that appear undamaged, show where a hit means disaster. That's where the planes that didn't return were struck." It was a simple reversal of logic, yet it flipped the entire approach to military engineering. Wald's conclusion was radical. Armor the areas without bullet holes. Reinforce the engines, the cockpit, the fuel lines, the places where damage meant no chance of return. The colonels exchanged uneasy glances. His reasoning was unsettling, not because it was wrong, but because it exposed a truth they hadn't seen. They had been blinded by what statisticians call survivorship bias, the mistake of learning from those who made it back, while ignoring those who didn't. Wald's insight was pure genius disguised as common sense. His method didn't just challenge authority, it rewrote the logic of wartime decision-making. Where others saw randomness, he saw hidden structure. He wasn't counting bullet holes, he was counting ghosts. Still, convincing the military brass wasn't easy. Commanders were trained to trust their eyes and experience, not abstract numbers from a refugee mathematician. But Wald's calm persistence, supported by rigorous calculations, gradually won them over. His mathematical proof left no room for doubt. When the U.S. Army Air Forces finally applied his recommendations, the results were immediate. Bombers' survival rates rose. Fewer crews went missing. Airmen began to notice. Their odds of returning alive had quietly improved. What Abraham Wald had done was more than mathematics. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that what we don't see often matters more than what we do. In the quiet of his New York office, Wald didn't celebrate. He simply adjusted his glasses, marked another equation on the board, and whispered to his colleagues, "It's not the bullets that tell the story. It's the silence between them."
Abraham Wald was never meant to be a soldier, yet destiny drafted him into a war unlike any other. Born in 1902 in Cluj, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he grew up in a modest Jewish family that valued learning above all else. His father ran a small shop. His mother managed the home, and young Abraham spent his childhood surrounded not by weapons or power, but by books and numbers. He was a quiet child, the kind who listened more than he spoke. But when he did speak, his words carried the precision of logic. Mathematics wasn't just his subject, it was his language, his way of seeing the world. By the time he entered university, his brilliance was undeniable. Equations that baffled others came naturally to him. His professors saw genius. But in Europe of the 1930s, being Jewish meant genius wasn't enough. As the shadow of fascism spread across the continent, doors began to close. Wald's opportunities vanished one by one, not because of his mind, but because of his identity. The Nazis didn't care about numbers, they cared about bloodlines. In 1938, with danger looming, Wald escaped Austria after the Anschluss, fleeing the Nazi takeover. He found refuge in the United States, a land of opportunity and irony. In New York, he joined the Statistical Research Group, SRG, an unusual wartime organization of mathematicians, economists, and scientists secretly tasked with solving military problems. Their weapons were chalkboards and probability models. Their battlefield a cramped office lined with data charts. To many military officers, these armchair scientists seemed detached from the reality of war. What could a room full of mathematicians possibly know about combat? But Wald didn't need to see battle to understand loss. He had already lost his homeland, his career, and many of his family members to the brutality of war. His motivation wasn't medals, it was meaning. When the Air Force came to SRG, desperate to understand why so many bombers were being shot down, most analysts followed the general's logic, reinforce the areas hit most often. Wald listened quietly, his mind already forming patterns others missed. He noticed what others ignored, the silence in the data, the planes that never returned. But when he shared his theory, that they should armor the areas without bullet holes, officers frowned. His suggestion sounded absurd, even reckless. Why protect the parts that aren't being hit? One colonel scoffed. Wald's answer was calm, but piercing. Because those are the parts that bring the planes home. Still, few listened. To them, he was a foreigner, a civilian, an academic. To history, he would become something greater. The man who saw life where others saw numbers. At that moment, Wald stood on the edge of one of the greatest revelations of the war. The quiet mathematician from Austria was about to change the fate of the skies, not with a gun, but with a mind sharper than any bullet.